The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Well, hello and welcome to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio. It's great to have you with us this afternoon as we sit down with another guest. This is the show where we do, of course, interview a different Christian every week about their life, about their faith, their testimony, and about what they do for a living or what they do in ministry. And of course, myself, Sam Hales, I'm with you today right the way through for the next hour or so. And I present this programme with a number of other journalists here at Premier. We take it in turns each week to interview a different guest. Before we get stuck into today's show, there's just time to remind you that this programme is brought to you in association with the magazine that I help edit. It's Premier Christianity magazine, and you can get yourself a free copy. We are giving it away. All you need to do is go to premierchristianity.com/free sample. We would be delighted to send you a copy of the latest issue of the magazine. There's news, there's features, reviews, columnists, all sorts of great material to get stuck into. So why not do that? It's premierchristianity.com/free sample. But today on The Profile, it is time to meet our guest. So let's do that now, shall we? I'm here with Sharon Grenham-Thompson. She's an Anglican minister, former prison chaplain and a broadcaster. She's also known as the Glam Vicar. Her new book is out now and it's titled Jailbird. Sharon, welcome to the programme.
Lovely to see you. Thanks for the invitation.
So where did this nickname Glam Vicar come from?
Well, actually, it was a very, very basic beginning. I joined Twitter, goodness knows how many years ago, right back at the beginning, and I needed a Twitter name. Yeah. And I tried to think of something that was, going to be distinctive, right, so that's the one I just picked upon, and I've been trying to live up to it ever since.
Brilliant. So you were first ordained in 1998, and remember you said at that point female vicars were very few and far between. So did you have to deal with, I guess, a lot of Vicar of Dibley references or even sexist comments to begin with?
Oh, yes. As I say in my book at the beginning, if I had £1 for every Vicar of Dibley reference, I'd be a very rich woman by now, that's for sure. Yeah, there was plenty of that. I mean, I think the issue has been that up until fairly recently, we've not had very much of a media representation of vicars, have we? And particularly not female vicars. Yeah. It has been, Dawn French and Vicar of Dibley until fairly recently. But we've also just had this kind of dichotomy, haven't we, of, well, you're either the spooky Catholic priest in the horror stories or you're the rather bumbling Church of England vicar. So there's not been that representation. So people haven't really understood, I suppose.
Absolutely. Despite the nickname Glam Vicar, you've actually spent a lot of your time ministering in a very unglamorous location of prisons, particularly Her Majesty's Prison Bedford, I know, for some years. But what was it that drew you to apply for those kind of positions as a chaplain in a prison?
Well, it was all a bit of an accident, really. It was never something I set out to do, although when I qualified as a solicitor and was a Christian at the time and then was going for ordination, my friends all said to me, oh, you'll be a prison chaplain one day. And my response was, no way, I'm not going to do that. And of course, look what happened. God has a sense of humour. I wasn't in parish ministry at the time, needed a job, wanted it to be a job in ministry of some sort. I'd been made redundant just recently, and just a job interview or a job advert came up. I thought, well, all right, I'll go for it, have a go. I turned up for the interview and quite by my surprise, I ended up with the job. So it was a real accident.
Wow, the rest is history, as they say. Brilliant. So I want to go back. Here on The Profile, we always talk about a person's early life, growing up. What was your early life like?
Well, I was born in Hampshire, spent some of my childhood in Surrey and most of my teenage years in North London, so I'm a good home counties girl. It was both very ordinary and happy bits and some not good bits, really. It was very varied, I suppose. For most of the time, it was myself, my brother, mum and dad. There were unhappy bits. It was a fairly turbulent time in lots of ways. My parents split up when I was 9. And my mum married again, married a chap who was in the army. We did a lot of moving around because of that. There were various issues at home, difficulties at home, difficult relationships and things like that. So that made life quite difficult for me. I didn't see my dad for quite a long time during my sort of growing up years, and then we got back in touch again. And there was also this incident that happened to me that I eventually discovered as a teenager that the person who I thought was my dad wasn't, in fact, my father.
Yeah, and you mentioned this story in the book. It's to do with school asking to see your birth certificate. And there's a bit of a story there, isn't there, about how you discovered it?
Oh, yes, there is. I mean, I'm old enough to be part of the era where we used to do O-levels, and I was coming up to O-levels, and we were all told that we needed to prove our identity so that the right name went on the right certificate or something like that, I don't know. So we had to bring in our birth certificate so school could get the right name. So I went home and asked for my birth certificate, and for some reason this caused great consternation, and it wasn't going to be possible, and I couldn't have it. And being the smart-ass teenager that I was, I did say, you could always go to St Catherine's house and get it, which didn't go down too well. In the end, anyway, I was furnished with a letter saying what my full name was and so on, and I took that into school. That was accepted, that was fine, but clearly I was different to everybody else, and I didn't like being different. I mean, what teenager does like being different? And it sort of made my radar twitch a bit. As I say, life wasn't great at home, and so this all seemed very odd. And I wondered, well, perhaps there's some great story here. Maybe my parents weren't married, or maybe, as I think it's a fantasy most of us have, maybe I was adopted and my real parents are a prince and princess from somewhere. Whatever it was, it all seemed rather strange. So I decided I was going to find out. Now, it's not necessarily perhaps the best thing I could have done. I went snooping, and I did find my birth certificate. And I did find that, the parents were married, that was fine. But the person who I thought was my dad was not, in fact, my father. Right. So that was obviously, you hear, don't you, about heart-stopping moments. Yeah. And this was a moment when my heart literally went boom, and brought out a whole load of questions for me then as well. Who am I? Where do I come from? Is there a whole family out there I know nothing about? Why has this been kept from me? What is this all about? And it sparked off quite a crisis in me. But because it really wouldn't have been helpful for me to bring that up at home or to mention how I'd found out, I kept it all to myself. And as a 14-year-old, to keep that kind of thing to yourself was a hard thing to do. Yeah.
And school life in general, was that, kind of normal mixture of...
When school ever normal?
Yes, is school ever normal? Was that happier or more stable than home life?
It was brilliant. Yeah. It really was good. I was very lucky to go to a series of really good schools, and whatever people's politics are, they were private schools. Yeah. Good or bad, I don't know. I was bright, so I passed exams to get in. Yeah. And I would say that those schools, especially my secondary school, was my saving grace. Right. Because when things were unstable at home, when I was feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, or I was useless and unlovable and nobody wanted me anyway, and all of those things, school was a place where I was okay. Yeah, I may have felt, a bit on the edge sometimes, but I could just be myself. I could be clever if that's where I was. I could experiment, I could try. And because they were the kind of places they were, they encouraged you to push yourself and have a go. And so particularly my secondary school made me believe I could do anything, really.
And where did faith factor into this time as a child? Do you have any kind of Christian background?
No, there was no Christian background in my family at all. Again, I'm old enough to be of the generation where at school you had a Christian assembly every day. Right, yeah. And it was very much there, kind of, in the background, by osmosis. When I was very little, 6, 7, 8, I was at a convent school, Catholic convent school, not a Catholic family. It was a good school. So that's where I went. The nuns were great, actually, fantastic. And they used to troop us along to Mass every Monday morning. But because I wasn't a Catholic, I couldn't go up and receive communion. But one day I decided I quite wanted this bit of God that was being handed out. So I filed up to the front with my Catholic schoolmates, knelt down, ready to get my bit of God. And along came the priest with the Mother Superior. And, of course, they knew I wasn't Catholic. Yeah. So they passed me by. Yeah. And that was quite a formative moment, right. Both positive and negative, in the sense of, gosh, I've been passed by God. Yeah. But also, I want some of that. And it was that, so although I was only little, I was sort of only 8 or so, it got me curious about what is all this stuff that goes on. Yeah. And I remember I used to go home and get a cardboard box, turn it upside down, put one of my mother's white tablecloths on the top, put a dressing up dress on over my clothes, and I would hold a little service in my bedroom. I didn't really know what I was doing, but it was just that, that beginning to explore of that. And you think, 8 years old, and I was already exploring what does it mean to stand behind an altar and say a service. Yeah. So, it was all there vaguely in the background.
There was something there.
Yeah,
there was something going on at an early age.
There was, that's right.
So when that sort of something materialised, was that more at university that
definitely
started to come through?
Yeah, it really was. I got through my teenage years with a vague idea about faith again, as I say. But I was carrying a lot of emotional baggage, a lot of hard stuff. And I got to university and all that difficult stuff kind of all exploded in a horrible mess all over the place. And it was not an easy time for me when I was there. Well, I think, when you've been quite suppressed, I suppose you might say, as a young person, and when life has been unhappy. And as I said, I kind of closed in myself, was quite lonely, quite isolated. The walls were up around me. And I had come away from much of my childhood feeling I was unlovable, I was stupid, I was ugly. Lots of negative things I'd come away with. And then I get to university and really got not much idea about how I should be in the world and how I should negotiate this, just being out of these very strict confines. So I think the first term I was very good, and I sat at my desk and I did my work and just went to all my lectures. And then the second term I discovered alcohol and the opposite sex and drugs. And then all of that lack of self-esteem, that inability to draw boundaries, all of those negative things, just channeled it all into really very self-destructive behaviour.
And this is why you were studying law, is that right?
Well, I was studying law because I kind of dropped into that by accident, really.
But you taught, you're bright people growing up, and you clearly have to be to go to university and study something as in-depth as that. And it was all going okay, and then, as you say, discovered these things in the second term, and that must have affected your studying.
It did, it did, because I then stopped being the good girl who sat at my desk and turning in my essays on time and that sort of thing, I'm still good friends with one of my tutors from that time. He sort of laughs at what a disaster I was at that point. And I wouldn't turn up to lectures. And the truth be told, though, actually, I got to the point where, as I say, I dropped into studying law by accident. And actually, I just found it really boring. I'd wanted to be something very creative, or writing or something like that.
Can't be creative with the law, can you?
You can't really, can you? Yeah. And it was just one of those things, family stuff, bit of pressure from there, that going off to art school or drama college just wasn't going to be the done thing. Yeah. My best friend was studying law, and I thought, OK, I'll do that then. Yeah. And that's how I stumbled into it. Yes, I was bright enough to get in and do it and all of those things, but I didn't really enjoy it. So that wasn't much of a motivation either. But I did it. I did get there. I got the degree in the end. So it was a frantic few weeks right towards the very end. Not much sleep, lots of Pro Plus. And I got there and I got the degree in the end. But it did suffer, and I'm sure I could have had a much easier time of it academically if I'd focused on that,
And tell me about this experience, age 19 in church. Would you describe, I read about it in the book, would you describe that moment as becoming a Christian?
Yeah, I would say that was a sort of dramatic conversion experience, if you like. So we've got all of this journey all the way up. I'm at university and it's sort of a mess. I've got these vague notions about religion going on in there somewhere, but no background to it and all of those sorts of things. And I had a boyfriend for a very short while, and then we didn't get together, and I didn't see him for a long time. And then about a year later, so when I was 19, turning 20, I met up with him again, and he was very different. He much more sorted, really seemed to have got his life together, and we had a couple of sort of late night conversations in the pub, about life, the universe and everything. And he began to talk to me about the fact that he had become a Christian, whatever that meant at that time. I wasn't really sure. Yeah. But I was quite impressed with the difference it had made in his life. And one of those people, if something intrigues me, as we found out with the birth certificate, I like to go and have a little find out about it. So I thought, I'm going to find out about this business then. And I was living in Reading, which is where I was at university, and very close to where my student house was, there was this little church nestled in amongst the estate, quite a modern church. And I thought, OK, right, I'm going to go along there one Sunday morning. So I got myself up, which was unusual for me on a Sunday morning.
Put on most students do.
Well, exactly, that's very true. Put on my best clobber, because I thought going to church, that's what you do. Your nice best clothes, skirt, heels, the lot. Very unlike me at that time as well. And that was my first mistake, because I walked in through the doors of the church and everyone was in jeans. Wow. So I really did stand out like a sore thumb. Yeah. But they were so welcoming. and without being pressurising. And there were lots of people there, all sorts of ages, clearly having a good time, but it meant something to them, and they spent time with each other afterwards. It was really good. And so as I was leaving, the young curate said to me, "Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it," because I said it was great. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." He said, "We've got a healing service this evening. Why don't you come along to that?" "Oh, yes, thank you very much," I said, sort of thinking, get me out of here. I went off home, and my housemates were quite amused at the thought that I'd been to church. So they said, "Oh, you're coming down the pub tonight then?" "No, I'm going to go back to church," I said. No, I don't know why I said that. It just came out. So I did go back in jeans this time. And this healing service took place, and it was basically Teze chants and nice quiet music and a little bit of a talk. And then the vicar stood up and said, "Okay, we're going to do some prayer for healing now. So if you would like someone to pray with you, then just come forward, and we've got a team here, and they'll lay hands on you and pray for you. If you don't want to come forward, but you want someone to pray for you, you can just stay in your place then. That's fine. There's no pressure. Just come forward if you want it." So I was sitting there thinking, oh, here comes the weird bit, not on your Nelly, I'm not doing anything, And I was just sat there in the seat. And then I was aware, as I describe this in the book, I was aware of a hand or a pushing on my shoulder, on my back. So I looked round, get off, I was about to say, and there was nobody there. There was just this sense of being very gently but insistently propelled forward. And then almost immediately after that, a sense of being pushed back as well, another physical sense. Right. So, this was really quite strange. And I was sat there and I was aware I was doing this forwards and back motion and this sense of pressure. And whilst I was sort of trying to work out what on earth was going on, I just found myself falling to my knees just where I was. And as my knees hit the floor, and, I'm quite a rational person, but this was just this amazing experience. It's a little bit graphic. When you've got a tummy upset and you kind of, everything comes out. I hope that's delicate enough. But there was that sense, as my knees hit the floor, that sense of whoosh, of just emptying out. And then this gentle light and warmth coming in. Just like, the Wesley My Heart Strangely Warmed thing. And these were all very physical sensations. And I didn't really have the language for it at the time, but I knew it was God. I just knew. And then I was aware that there were people who had obviously seen something going on and were there and were just sitting by me, just praying quietly. And the tears came, so crying and crying. And all I could say was, "Thank you, God. Thank you. Thank you." Really vivid moment. Yeah, and I guess that was the kind of the start of it all, really.
Yeah. And I love how you mentioned that the thing that made you want to go to church in the first place was because you'd seen something in another person that had actually changed his life. And it wasn't just, I have a new set of beliefs, but something real had happened. And clearly, as you described that experience, it was something, you say, very physical. But how did it affect your life?
Well, gosh, in lots of ways, some of which were probably a bit extreme at the time. I was very into karate as a student. I won a bronze medal in the British Karate Championships. Wow. Yeah, so all of those things. I was very into that. But one of the things that the sort of group of people that surrounded me at the time said, "Oh, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not a Christian thing to do." I'm not sure I agree with that now, but at the time I thought, okay. So I gave up my karate. Okay. I got rid of a lot of the music I used to listen to. I stopped the drug smoking and things immediately. I stopped getting drunk. All those things. My relationships became much more regular and much more sorted. So really did. I mean, there's a lot of giving up, if you like, at the time. But hey, I needed to do that. I really did.
And just goes to show that what you'd experienced was so life-changing that it was worth giving these other things up.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And that didn't matter so much. Yeah. Oh, amazing. So obviously quite a powerful conversion experience. And at what point after that did you start to think about ministry and becoming a vicar?
Well, the church, I carried on going to that church then during the rest of my university time. And then when I graduated, I stayed on in Reading. And married the boyfriend, and we worshipped there for a while. And because we were both pretty creative types, but I suppose I've also got the gift of the gab, maybe, and was a bit of a leadership type person anyway. The vicar was great, and he could see that we had a lot that we wanted to offer, and that we were really had a heart for mission. And so he invited us to take part in things, away days, to lead family services, and so I just began to explore all of that leadership kind of stuff and felt so at home and felt that was great. I qualified as a solicitor in 92, and I found that while I've been training for the law, people would come to my office in a state. I was dealing with people who'd gone bankrupt or whose marriages had broken down, who'd lost their houses, whose companies had gone bust, all those kinds of very personal things. They'd come to my desk in a mess. I'd go to court, hopefully sort things out for them, wave them on their way. I didn't see them before. I didn't see them after. And I wanted to do more. Yeah. And that new, quite passionate Christian faith of mine, I wanted to bring that to bear in how I dealt with people. And I wanted to bring in all that creative side that I was doing at church as well. And so just gradually, with some conversations with people, with the vicar and so on, he suggested to me that maybe what I should be looking at is exploring ordination. So it went from there, really.
Wow, fantastic. You already mentioned that growing up was difficult. I know you described your past as troubled and turbulent. I wonder, do you feel like any of that then affected your adult life in any way? Was any of that difficult moments in childhood, affecting you sort of later in life when you're exploring ordination and going into this new career path?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I speak about in the book, which I haven't sort of really very publicly spoken about before, is that I was a victim of sexual abuse as a young girl, so from the age of 11 for a few years. That stays with you for the rest of your life, no matter how much healing, I honestly believe I have found. Nevertheless, the effects are there with you. And it's taken me till now to really find that full healing. So for many, many years in my adult life, that sense of, again, aloneness and brokenness and fear and self-disgust and all those things that you will hear survivors talk about, all of those things were with me. So that affected relationships I made with people. I was very untrusting, defensive, ready to expect that people would reject me, so I'd reject them first. All the classic psychologist dream kind of stuff, And as I say, having grown up, although, my relationship with my dad is great, but because he and my mum broke up, he wasn't around for a fair bit of my time. So, again, I just felt very confused about where I belonged in the world. Relationships, therefore, because of the fractured issues with dad figures and difficulties with my mum, all of those meant I didn't know how to relate to men in particular, and so found myself sort of very much, when I say at the mercy of, that makes me sound a bit sort of weak. I don't mean that, but people sort of barged into my life and kind of ordered me about, if you like. All of those things stayed with me for a very long time. The things I had to begin to address, clearly, as I went forward for ordination. I didn't actually get through the first time I applied. It took me 2 goes, which is probably no bad thing as well. But, some of these things are a lifetime of undoing.
Cool.
And now I'm at a stage where, those things haven't all gone, but I recognise them now. I think now in maturity, I can see that sometimes when my reactions are getting a bit defensive or I'm feeling a bit insecure, I can see that is just a character trait that's probably come from those early days, but I can put that gently to one side now. And I think being open and honest about the things that have affected me has helped hugely as well.
Sure. Well, that brings us to the end of part 1, but join us again in a moment to hear more from Sharon Grenham-Thompson. She's an Anglican vicar, former prison chaplain and broadcaster, and her latest book is out now and it's titled Jailbird.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio. I'm Sam Hales, and today my guest is Sharon Grenham-Thompson. She's an Anglican minister, former prison chaplain and broadcaster. She's also known as the Glam Vicar, and her new book is out now. It's titled Jailbird. So we were just discussing at the end of part 1 your route to ordination, and of course you are the Glam Vicar, so that process, you said you didn't make it first time around, but second time around you did. A huge part of your ministry has been working in prisons. So I'd love to know a bit more about that. I would imagine going into working in a prison environment, everyone has some preconceived ideas about what a prison is like, and presumably some of those ideas were smashed fairly quickly. Can you talk a bit about what your expectations were and whether they were met?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I had, in one sense, a fairly gentle introduction to it in some ways, because the first establishment I worked in was very modern. It was a youth institution called a Secure Training Centre for 12 to 17-year-olds. So it was very modern build. So it was more like a big rambling school or something, rather than a prison. But you still have the high fences and the barbed wire and all that sort of thing. But yes, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people I've met over the years who said to me, I wouldn't want to work in a prison, and I perhaps brought volunteers in to help with the work I'm doing or something like that. And they've come in and said, oh, no, I can't stand it. It makes me feel really spooked. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. Whereas actually the first time, it just didn't bother me at all. It was just fine. Yeah. When I was training for the law, I had done a little bit of prison visiting. We had the Christian Union at Guildford School of Law, and we'd gone into HMP Coldingley to hold a session there through the chaplaincy. So I'd kind of seen inside that way a little bit as well. Yeah, I suppose, you only get to see what's on telly, don't you? Porridge and things like that. But it wasn't really in the forefront of my mind when I went in. I think the first time I went in, as I say, to this secure training centre, it was my first day in a new job anyway. I was so nervous that in many ways the environment was the last thing on my mind, but rather, what have I got to do with this job? But there are preconceptions about prison. The usual phrase that people come out with, it's all a holiday camp. Let me say here and now, it isn't. Right. Really not. So that preconception is very
Well, you hear,
untrue.
don't you, about, they got Sky TV in all of their rooms and stuff. That isn't true.
No, it's not. It's not true. The televisions are there, but they are paid for. Right. They have to be earned. If there's misbehaviour, they're taken away. And at the very highest level of earned privileges, there is the opportunity to have a PlayStation on occasion, has to be paid for, will be taken away for misdemeanours. And also when you have a situation where perhaps you're being locked up from 7 in the evening to 7 the following morning, a human being has to have something to do. And you don't improve anyone's behaviour by having them staring at a wall. Sure. So in one sense, there has to be something.
Yeah, I guess this speaks right to the heart of a national debate, arguably, of what prison is for. Is prison for punishment, or is prison for rehabilitation? Do you have a view on that?
I think it's for both. I think wrongdoing has to be dealt with, and I've been very clear about that in my book. It's not all bleeding heart. People do wrong. Society says this is so wrong that you need to be removed from us for some time for you to understand the gravity of what you have done. So I think there is a place for a punitive element, if you like. But for me, that punishment is the removal of freedom. It is being put behind those walls. It's not a joke. There can be very scary places. So that is the punishment, the deprivation of freedom. But I think, with the exception of, probably only about 40 or 50 people, every prisoner currently in our system is going to be back out in society again because they haven't got a whole life sentence. So therefore, there has got to be a rehabilitative element. And I think that has to be a huge element because if people have got it so far down the wrong pathway, whatever the reasons, and there may be good reasons, but if they're so far down that pathway, then they're not just going to turn themselves around and walk back on a right one. Yeah. So therefore, we have a stake in kind of trying to get them to the right pathway.
And presumably that's exactly where your job comes in as a prison chaplain, to help with rehabilitation. Is that how you view your role?
It was lots of things. I mean, it was so many things at once. But yes, rehabilitation is a massive, massive part of it. My job most recently in Bedford Prison, where I was for 5 years, I was in a high security prison before that. But the job at Bedford, where I was a senior chaplain, was to oversee a whole raft of chaplains so that anyone who came into prison with a religious background, whatever faith that may have been, was able then to practice that faith in the right kind of environment, in an appropriate environment to assist with their rehabilitation. But then we were also there for people of faith or no faith for pastoral care. Again, you come into that situation where your liberty has been removed from you, rightly so, but you leave behind a life out there, possibly a girlfriend or a partner, children, parents, all those things. And that's a very dislocating experience. You're also, a prisoner would find that this was possibly the lowest point in their life when they have messed up big time. And that's when they'd ask the big questions. So therefore, to be there alongside for both the inside time as well as a view to the outside time was a really important part.
Yeah, I mean, I often hear people talking about things like alpha in prisons, and I guess the theory is that, well, when you're in prison at the lowest point in your life, you realise all other options have failed, and that's when, for some people at least, God comes into the picture. They start asking those big questions. So was that your experience with people? Did you have those kind of, I guess, deep conversations with people about the things that really matter?
Yeah, on more than one occasion. I think you're absolutely right. For someone who is predisposed to actually realise that this is the bottom. And interestingly enough, it was not the younger men who were at that position. It was often the men in their, because I've only really worked with men for most of my career, only the men who were perhaps in their late 20s, early 30s, going into their 40s. So perhaps at that life stage where they suddenly realise, hang on a minute, this has been too many years doing this. Here I am again. I am at rock bottom. My partner's going to leave me. I'll never see my kids again. You know, I'm in now for a long stretch, and suddenly whack, it hits them in the face. And so that is often when they would then break down a lot of the time and try to work out, well, what do I do now? Where do I go now? So without, there are people who say, oh yeah, and then the chaplains just swoop in and someone's vulnerable and you just whack God on them, and of course they're going to go for that. It wasn't about that, but it was about accompanying someone in that journey, and listening to the story, often a very sad, very tragic story. Doesn't excuse the wrongdoing, but can often be a reason for it. And then begin to talk about forgiveness and hope and healing, and how I understand God to be that. Some really, really special conversations on occasion. Yeah.
You mentioned hope. I guess the question is, what hope do you offer someone who is in prison for 20, 30 years? What's the, how do you counsel someone through that? What's the difference that God can make in that situation?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing I learned very quickly was that, there aren't any easy answers for someone like that. So to turn around and say, oh, it'll all be fine, and, just hold on to God, that's all pretty meaningless. Yeah. But actually to look at the biblical stories of darkness and struggle, to look at Good Friday, if you like, but actually point time and time again through the Bible to how that Good Friday, that darkness is turned to light in ways that we don't always understand, ways that we don't always expect, and to encourage people to look for the light, however small the chink might be during that time. And also to help people to see that there are still opportunities for living, even in the prison environment. As harsh and as difficult as that might be, there are opportunities for living. And that may be in education, in reading, in getting involved in spiritual things, in the chaplaincy, in work, in using that time positively despite the limitations that are there.
And I wonder if, again, your own sort of personal story and background is helpful in this sense, because you mention in the book quite honestly about depression and your own struggle in that area. Are you able to kind of draw on those experiences? I mean, you mentioned the kind of no pat answers thing of, don't worry, it'll be okay. Clearly, because you yourself have struggled in incredibly difficult times, you're not going to tell people, oh, don't worry, it'll all be fine.
No, exactly. And I've been able to be. I didn't really share much of my own personal story. That wasn't necessary or appropriate. But I was able to from experience to say to people, there will be times when it'll feel like God's not there, and it'll feel as if the whole world is against you and you were just in a big black hole. But hold on. And there were times when, I would deal with men who were self-harming, suicidal, for whom life was just one big black hole. But those times, it was about the power then, I think, of relationship. And I think so often, don't you think that the gospel is told and communicated through relationship? I mean, that's how I first came to faith. It's about, if you say you're going to go back and see somebody, you go back. You listen, you talk, you show them value just as a human being, just whatever their story might be. And I suppose all those experiences for me of all those years of not feeling valued or feeling abandoned, feeling rejected, I kind of know what that feels like to be on that receiving end. So try to flip that and help people to see that they do have some value and they can find that again. And there are people who will listen and will walk with them. So that was a bulk of what I was doing in those early days with a lot of people. Yeah. Do
you have any particular, I guess, stories of people you met who had a particular impact on you, or you just think there's a particular story there that, I mean, there's loads in the book, but any off the top of your head that you wanted to share from people you met?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are lots actually, but one I do refer to in the book was when I worked in the high security prison, and within that prison there was a separate unit within that prison, which is quite topical at the moment, of course, as they're looking at expanding that kind of facility. So this guy was in this prison within a prison because he'd been involved in gang stuff and gangster stuff, and he'd given evidence against some of his co-defendants. So he had to be kept away from most of the prison population because his life was in danger as a result. He was also going to have a new identity and so on when he was eventually released, all that sort of stuff. So he was in quite an isolated situation, and they were housed in very, very small units, 3 or 4 guys just in one small unit, and I felt that the vicar still needed to go and call in there as well, so I would go in and visit, and that was always quite amusing because it was really all the things you'd imagine, the CCTV and the locked doors and the buzzers and the central control and those sorts of things. Big tough prison officers as well as the big tough prisoners, and there was me, this sort of little girl vicar wandering in. But I'd go week after week and just sit with the guys and talk about what was in the paper and what they were doing, and just josh with them and just build relationship, I guess, with them. And one day this chap said to me, can we have a private word? And we went into one of the quiet rooms, and he started to tell me all about his life and about this whole gangster stuff, about the fact that his dad was going to come and see him, but his dad had terminal cancer and he didn't think he was going to see his dad again. And when we got out of prison, he was going to change identity and was going to leave behind all of this. So he was a very confused kind of guy. So I then made a point of going to see him regularly, talking through his story, talking through, ironically enough, issues of identity and identity in God, and forgiveness and reconciliation and those sorts of things. And I began to take communion to him, and we would pray together. We'd begin to read the Bible together. He saw his dad, and they were reconciled. And this prisoner began to understand more about the Bible, began to write to people and make amends for some of the things he tried to do. His behaviour on the prison unit improved, and he was much more helpful and not so, bolshy and sweary and all those things. Excuse me. And just before I left that prison, he told me his sort of some of the real stuff, his real name and some of his real background and all those sorts of things, which was a huge privilege, I thought. That's an overused word, but it just spoke to me of that sense of communication from this place of him being this gangster guy to someone who had learnt to show his vulnerability and had begun to turn to God. And a little while later, I got one more letter from him saying that he had a partner and had begun to attend church, had a home, had a job. And now I don't know. He's disappeared into the system, new identity, new place. Don't know anything about him. But, I was really touched by that please God, he did carry on along some sort of reasonable pathway. But there was that sense that I'd been allowed to be part of that journey for a while. And I hope God had spoken to him through me, so that was fantastic.
That's great. Now, I guess for many people when they watch TV and see some of these particularly horrific crimes that people are sent to prison for, words like monster are used to describe people, and one would presume that in your job you can't really think like that, even if people have committed awful crimes. As you say, you have to go in and build relationship with people, but that must be incredibly difficult. I mean, I know you weren't working necessarily in the most secure prisons. I think you're one category down. You were for a while. Well, in that situation where you're meeting murderers, what goes through your head before a conversation with someone like that?
Well, sometimes I didn't know. It's not the done thing when you're first meeting somebody to say, so what are you in here for? It's kind of prison etiquette. You don't do that.
No.
Sometimes I did know. Sometimes I needed to know for my own safety because there were times when precautions had to be taken. And other times I knew because it was a high-profile person. So it was always a mixed bag. And in fact, the murderers weren't just in the high-security estate. They can be in the sort of the normal prisons too. But there were sometimes I met people who I knew very well what they'd done, and it was appalling. And there is a sense of nervousness of, well, what is this person going to be like? But so often, particularly in the times, I guess, when I didn't know, you'd think, you're just a normal guy. Wow. Yeah. And that was sometimes the most surprising thing, was that actually somebody comes across such a normal guy, and was a human being like me, like you, was also capable of such a depth of wrongdoing and terrible things. And I think we tend to call people like that monsters and demonise them almost literally, because we can't bear to think that a human being can do those things, if you see what I mean. If we accept that person is human, then we're almost accepting that we all have the capacity for such levels of depravity, I suppose might be the word. And so we dehumanise. But actually they're human beings, and do things. I'm not saying we're all capable of doing those most appalling things, but it's on a spectrum. So I suppose really I just try to approach them as a human being who's done something terrible. But that was then, and now I was faced with this person, and whilst not condoning anything that they might have done, I've got to help them find a way forward. Because that is the only way you can go, is forward. For some of those people, it was going to be for the rest of their life in prison. But they still got to live in some way.
Yeah. And I guess, again, for a Christian chaplain, that you've got, remarkable biblical support for your job. Verses come to mind about you're in prison, you visited me, and I'm sure you've heard all the jokes before about having a captive audience. But how, it must be very different from, in inverted commas, normal parish ministry, because I imagine a lot of the time you're ministering to people who wouldn't necessarily call themselves Christians for a start. Do you think the church in general needs to have more of that kind of outward-looking attitude, to not just be caring for those who call themselves Christians, but for looking to go out into the community, whether it's prisons or schools? Do you feel like progress needs to be made in that area? I
think there's an awful lot of incredibly good work that does actually go on in those environments and in all sorts of environments. I mean, I did say that I felt that the prison was frontline mission, because, as you say, by and large, the people that I'm encountering do not have any kind of Christian heritage, or maybe a vague one from Granny or something like that, but they don't really know what it's all about. So you're often going from very, very first principles, which is a hugely important thing for us to be doing. I mean, I think if there's any progress, I would say, particularly in relation to prison ministries, that needs to be made, and which in part I think my book is trying to address, is to raise the profile of Christian ministry within prisons. Right, there are all these prisons across the country, hundreds, and there are hundreds of chaplains, paid, part-time, unpaid, all those sort of things, and of other faiths as well, who are going in every day into the situations I describe, and trying to speak of God, but also trying to humanise and to accompany in the way I've said. And, it's not really a criticism, but I think if there's any encouragement I would give to the church, it's this really is a mission field. And although it isn't allowed to proselytise in prison, nevertheless, we can care and we can proclaim the gospel there, which is what colleagues did all the time. But perhaps a little invisibly. I mean, I say in the book, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that as I was coming into ministry, there was always this, this view that there were tiers of ministry, and if you were, were really there and really good, you'd have your parish, and then you'd go up through the ranks, and one day you'd be some senior clergy person, and hey, you'd be fantastic. If you weren't quite that brilliant, but you were okay, and you were pottering along, then you'd get through, and you'd be a nice vicar of a nice town or lovely rural place sometime. And that will be good. If you blotted your copybook a little bit, maybe your marriage didn't work out or whatever, then, well, you'd probably go into hospital chaplaincy. And if you were the lowest of the low, you'd be a prison chaplain. No, I mean, that's not true. Of course it's not. But I did come across that attitude. Right, yeah. And there is still a little bit of that. It's, if you're a prison chaplain, you're out of the way. And I just want to bang the drum for prison chaplains. It's fantastic ministry. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of Christians are really encouraged to hear the kind of stories you're saying about ministering. And I think I would like to hope, of course, that most Christians totally understand the need for that. Yeah. However, there's another area you've worked in where I think a lot of Christians are quite sceptical of, they don't like so much, like to complain about perhaps, and that's the media. And you've been in the media a fair amount, as I say, a broadcaster on BBC Radio. What's that been like?
Oh, it's been such fun. It's been brilliant. No, by and large, been a hugely positive experience. I mean, I've been broadcasting on radio now for, must be about 12 years. Got into it again. Most of my life seems to have happened by accident. Got into it by accident. Lots of God incidences, I'm sure. Mainly on BBC Radio, although branching out a little bit now.
You made it to Premier.
I've made it.
That's it. You've made it now.
And it really has been lots of fun. I've been on Radio 4 and Radio 2, two very different BBC radio stations. One slightly more serious, slightly more religious, if you like, and then Radio 2, the last 5 years, on with Chris Evans on The Breakfast Show, doing the Pause for Thought slot. And it's such fun. I mean, it is zany, it's wacky, but where else am I going to get, a congregation of millions where in, I hope, an approachable, fun, light-hearted way, but ultimately serious underneath way, I can actually just highlight little gospel principles on a regular basis and just speak into people's lives. One of the people I was always really inspired by, although he was not a Christian, was Rabbi Lionel Blue. And he, in one of his books, he says he just wanted to enter into people's normal life and speak something of faith into their normal life. And that's what I want to do as well. And that's what I've really tried to do with my media work. Yeah. But as you say, it hasn't always gone down well.
Can you give an example of that? Why has it not gone down so well?
Well, I mean, I suppose like most people in the media, once you put your head above the parapet, particularly in these days of Twitter, you're going to get the trolls. Yeah. And particularly as I'm a woman, I do get that kind of pretty unpleasant stuff as well. I mean, you deal with it in the end. But I have had one or two people contact me through my website or various other places and say, you need to decide if you're a Christian or a media star. You can't be both. And there's sort of anger and bitterness, I suppose, in some ways. Yeah. But actually, faith isn't a box. It's not a compartment. We live in a very media-dominated world. It's one of the ways so many of us communicate, that actually for Christians to be absent from that would be a travesty. So my feeling is I want to be there. It's something I think I'm quite good at. If I can relate to people and talk to people and say, hey, Christians aren't all weird people sitting there disapproving of you. Actually, we have the same struggles, the same hopes and dreams in lots of ways as anyone. But we do it within this framework of faith. Then I would think that's a really good thing to do.
Absolutely. Presumably it must be quite difficult to craft a script, though, because there must be pitfalls. I mean, one that comes to mind, and perhaps this is a criticism in general of some of the sort of BBC faith slots, is it can just come across as Christians moralising, perhaps on particular issues. How do you avoid that? And I guess when you're sitting down to write a script, what do you have in mind, or who do you have in mind that you're trying to reach?
Oh, gosh, it depends, obviously, very much who your audience is. So if I'm writing a breakfast show script, let's take it for that. I mean, I've got some idea now of the demographic of who listens to that show. Actually, it's pretty wide, it has to be said. But you've also got the context. It's a fast-moving, wacky, topical, family-friendly kind of show. So I've got to bear that in mind as well. And it's not the kind of show where you can go on and be all moralistic, because actually you get shot down in flames pretty quickly, certainly on Facebook, if nothing else, and you wouldn't be asked back. So really my first premise is what's topical, what are people talking about, people of faith or not, what are people talking about, who is listening, what are they going to be concerned about at the moment, is there something going on in my life, a very ordinary thing, but that I can point to God in that, or just literally something that can give people a moment to think. So often I'm using something happened with my kids or the dog or at home or work or whatever. I say to people, beware what you say to me, because one day it will be used in a script. You never know. Yes. So I personally try to start from very ordinary, everyday things and point to something of the spiritual in those. It's also all about your delivery, of course, and that takes a bit of practice. Because the script has to be written, it has to be submitted the day before to make sure it doesn't breach any of the BBC's guidelines about impartiality or any of those sorts of things. And it has to go through a producer who brings out a red pen, metaphorically speaking, so you can't say that. So it's gone through a bit of working. So it ends up being a page of script. And the deal is you stick to that script, certainly in what you're delivering in your pause for thought. You don't really deviate from that because that's what's been agreed. So it'd be very easy for that to sound very read, so you could read it through and that would be dull as ditch water. So some of the skill comes in translating that written word into a conversational style.
Yeah, and I think some of the skill as well, particularly for us as Christians, is to speak into a mainstream audience and not use those Christian cliches.
Oh, yeah.
Because that isn't going to help, as you say, for a mainstream audience. Do you feel like more broadly, though, for whether we're broadcasting or not, Christians need to learn how to speak to a modern world, which is, by all statistics that I've seen, becoming more and more secular?
Yeah, I think we do need to. I think we're starting, but we need to continue to understand that people don't speak our language. People haven't been brought up with that Christian framework, and things that might be just bread and butter to us are meaningless in lots of ways. There are surveys, aren't there, that say certain percentages of people don't really even know what Christmas is about, don't know what Easter is about, and I think we really need to take that on board. And we need to take on board, I think, that as much as we love Jesus, as much as we follow him and he inspires us, and he certainly inspires me, the way we talk about him can either be encouraging and inspiring or just off-putting. And it's just being aware of how we deliver things and being real. Again, we all the way through we've spoken about telling our story and how that is what has a real impact on people. And I think if we can tell our story about how faith has changed us or helped us or what it's done for us, that in the end is far more authentic than anything else.
Absolutely. Well, that story, as you say, is now in front of me here in printed form. It's Jailbird. It's out now, published by Lion. And available now. So Sharon Grenham-Thompson, it's been fascinating to chat. Just got to finish by asking you what the future holds. You've got the story, you've got the book here. What are you looking forward to in the next few years?
Well, I'm really enjoying settling back into parish life. They're keeping me very busy, that's for sure. But I might have another book brewing as well. You never know. So watch this space.
Keep on coming. Fantastic. Well, that brings us to the end of the profile. Thank you very much, Sharon Grenham-Thompson, for speaking to us today.
Mike Tirico here with some of the 2024 Team USA athletes. What's your message for the team of tomorrow?
To young athletes, never forget why you started doing it in the first place.
You have to pursue something that you're passionate about.
Win, lose, or draw, I'm always going to be the one having a smile on my face.
Finding joy in why you do it keeps you doing it.
Be authentic, be you, and have fun.
Joy is powering Team USA during the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Comcast is proud to be bringing that inspiration home for the team of tomorrow.